It is now day 27 of the government shutdown, and the feud between the president and the Speaker of the House is only getting worse. Today, the president wrote House Speaker Nancy Pelosi a letter to inform her he's canceling a trip that she had planned abroad. The president says, "I am sure you would agree that postponing this public relations event is totally appropriate." He goes on to reference the shutdown and say that it would be better if you were in Washington negotiating with me. This is in response to Speaker Pelosi's letter asking the president to postpone a State of the Union address because of the shutdown. CBS News chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cortez joins us now from Washington. Nancy, what did we know about this trip that Nancy Pelosi was planning to take, and what was the president's argument for calling it off?
Well, what we know is that this is something that's called, in short, a CODEL, a congressional delegation, a group of lawmakers, typically going somewhere overseas, often to a war zone, either to meet with the troops or to meet with overseas diplomats and world leaders. And it's something that that members of Congress typically do when Congress is in recess, as it was supposed to be next week until congressional leaders decided to cancel the recess because we are still in a government shutdown. And so often the details of these trips are not disclosed in advance for security reasons. It was not widely known that Nancy Pelosi was expected to go and had her bags packed to go to Brussels and Egypt and Afghanistan for what was going to be a trip of some length. And just 45 minutes before this trip was due to depart from Andrews Air Force Base, this letter from the president went to the House Speaker telling her that I'm sure you would agree that postponing this public relations event is totally appropriate, given that 800,000 American workers are not receiving pay. The Speaker's office would argue that a trip to Egypt and Afghanistan is not exactly a public relations event, but nevertheless, we do now have essentially a tit-for-tat, a response from the president to the provocation 24 hours earlier from the House Speaker when she sent him a letter informing him that she thinks it would be better for him to postpone his State of the Union address scheduled for later this month if the shutdown is still taking place for a somewhat different reason. She was arguing that because the Department of Homeland Security is one of the agencies that is currently underfunded and you've got a lot of people working without pay, that you wouldn't want to tax those Secret Service agents and other federal law enforcement officers further by having them work overtime during a big security event like the State of the Union.
You know, Nancy, a lot of people have accused Nancy Pelosi of politicizing this. This is a political maneuver by having the president postpone the State of the Union. Some of her critics are saying that. What was she trying to accomplish by doing that?
Well, I'm sure that there was a political element, and possibly that was the prime element in her thinking when she decided to send this letter to the president. She knows that there is nothing like a State of the Union to give a president the bully pulpit. They speak for an hour or more, primetime television in that very grand setting in the well of the House of Representatives, all of Congress listening to them, applauding. You've got the diplomatic corps, you've got the Supreme Court justices. It is sort of tailor-made for allowing a president to get their argument across. And one can assume that if the government were still shut down at the point where the president gave that address, that he would have some choice words about Democrats and accusing them of being to blame for shutting down the government and talking about how much the country needs more funding for a border wall. So she was certainly looking to deny him that opportunity. But in her letter, she sort of cloaked that in the rhetoric of why would we, have a high security event like this in the middle of a government shutdown? And a lot of us were wondering, Rena, how the president was going to react to her letter. And one of the people who was wondering was Nancy Pelosi herself, because we hadn't seen any tweets from the president, no reaction from the White House. So this morning, I asked her point blank about what she was expecting to hear from the president. I think we have some tape of that. Take a listen. If the president comes back to you and says, no, I want to give the State of the Union at the Capitol on the date we agreed to, what will you do then? Will you allow it to go forward?
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But we haven't heard. It's very silent, more than 24 hours.
And so we obviously have now heard Rena. And one of the sort of unusual things about this presidential tactic is that the Department of Defense unlike the Department of Homeland Security, is not shut down. It actually is funded. So she would be flying on a military transport jet overseas, meeting with other military members who are being paid. So it is not exactly the same situation as the one that that the Speaker had laid out the day before when she was talking about the State of the Union, because the Department of Homeland Security is not funded. And beyond that, you have other members of the administration who are being allowed by the president to travel during this shutdown overseas. You've got the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who just returned from a big trip to the Middle East and is due to go back overseas again to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, with a very large delegation, including the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin. And as far as we know, the president hasn't tried to put a stop to that trip.
It was hard to ignore in the line where it says you're welcome to fly commercial to Afghanistan.
Right.
Must be great for frequent flyer miles, not so much for personal security on that trip. Nancy, you know, the bottom line here with the shutdown, though, these innocent people who are without paychecks, who are just really trying to get food on the table. Is there any ray of hope on this shutdown? Are we going to get any chance of seeing both sides start talking?
Well, here's the irony, Rena, you know, is at the same time that the president is saying to Speaker Pelosi, I just feel that it would be better if you were in Washington negotiating with me. There are no negotiations planned. The last meeting between the president and the speaker ended almost before it began, with the president convening everyone at the White House, only to walk out by his own admission a few minutes later when Pelosi said that she was not in favor of the wall. And there have been no face-to-face negotiations since. As far as we could tell from talking to our sources, there are really no back-channel negotiations going on either, and nothing in the schedule. So whether Nancy Pelosi is here or not, there are simply no conversations going on between congressional leaders and the president at this point. Doesn't mean that that couldn't all change tomorrow, but as of right now, things are really at a stalemate.
All right, Nancy Cordes coming to us from our Washington bureau. Nancy, thank you very much.